Hello, Jeff Zwaring here, and welcome back to Give and Take, the segment of our show where we explore important scientific ideas to help you be more convinced of the truth of Christianity. Today, I'm honored to be joined by Dr. John Lennox, and we're going to be discussing the new movie that he's produced, Against the Tide. Dr. Lennox, it's good to have you here.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be on your show.
So I know you got you're an emeritus professor of mathematics at Oxford. You're a pretty accomplished person, have done a lot of debates. I know you've got this new movie, Against the Tide, out, and I just kind of wanted to ask you, what is it that you were hoping to accomplish? Why did you decide to be involved with this movie?
Well, it wasn't my idea. It was the idea of Steve Huff of the Pensmore Foundation. And he was very concerned about the dominance of naturalism in the academy. And he'd read one of my books and he came to Oxford to look me up and said that he'd like to do something in order to help people to understand what the issues are. And we became friends, and over quite a lengthy period of time, he came up with the idea of a film starring Kevin Sorbo. I think it's been a brilliant idea, actually, but that's how it started. It wasn't in my head at all.
What are some of the central issues you see in combating naturalism?
Well, the first one really is that naturalism is essential to science. And I want to say that actually modern science was conceived in a Christian cradle. And many people think that science and belief in God are they exclude each other. And I want to argue that that's not true historically. And it's not true either when you investigate the nature of science. And furthermore, I really think that naturalism undermines human rationality. So that whereas my basic thesis is that science and God mix very well, that atheism and science don't mix very well, which is quite a controversial position, but I think one that's amply justifiable by the arguments.
But I'd like to explore that, your statement that atheism actually undermines science. On what basis do you say that? What's the evidence for that?
Well, this is an idea that goes back a very long way, but C.S. Lewis, Alvin Plantinga, and Tom Nagel are, to my mind, the three major people that realize it. And Lewis made the point years ago, presciently actually. He said, any theory that human thinking is invalid is, of course, logically incoherent. And that is advanced because if we ask, and I often do, ask my fellow scientists what they do science with, well, they usually say the brain because they don't believe that the mind is distinct from the brain, but allowing that. And then I ask them, tell me the brief history of the brain. And they say, well, the brain, to sum up, is the end product of a mindless, unguided process. And I usually then say, look, if you knew that your computer that you use every day was the end product of a mindless, unguided process, would you trust it? And the interesting thing, Jeff, is I've always had the answer no. And I said, look, you've got a problem then, because you've got a problem with your own brain or mind. Why would you trust it when this is its origin that you wouldn't even give credence to in connection with your computer? You have a real problem. Whereas in the Christian worldview, the reason why the universe out there is at least in part accessible to the human mind is that both the universe and the human mind are traceable back to the same intelligent creator.
You know, I find that a very fascinating statement. You know, and I appreciate the way you've articulated that. I know C.S. Lewis has quotes where he articulates that idea that if we can't trust our mind, how in the world can we trust what we're thinking about with it? When you've talked to scientists who are skeptical or who have a naturalist viewpoint, and you've presented this, how have they responded? What sorts of things have you seen effective in maybe helping them see things from a different point of view, and have they responded?
Well, sometimes it's hilarious because, of course, what we're talking about here is reductionism. And I could well remember a famous occasion with a very, very eminent biochemist who said he was a reductionist, everything can be reduced to physics and chemistry. He was an atheist and we'd nothing to discuss. So we were having dinner together, and on the table was a menu, and I said, do you mind if we do an experiment? And he said, what, at dinner? I said, sure, this is Oxford. So I pointed out the menu, and he said, what's the problem? It says roast chicken. I said, there's no problem, but you're a reductionist. Yes, everything can be reduced to physics and chemistry. Yes. I said, okay, look at these marks, R-O-A-S-T. They're marks on paper made with ink. Now, you explained to me the way in which they carry the meaning roast chicken, using only the physics and chemistry of the paper and ink. And there was utter silence, at which point his wife said, get out of that if you can. But he didn't try. He said something that I shall never forget. He said, look, he said, I have gone into my laboratory for 40 years thinking it could be done, but it so obviously can't. He said, where did you get that argument? I said, don't worry, I got it from a Nobel Prize winner. And then, of course, I said, what do you work on? He said, DNA. Oh, I said, that's very interesting. That's a longer word in a chemical alphabet, much longer than R-O-A-S-T. Tell me about it, its origin. Oh, he said, chance and necessity. I said, just a minute. You had a 5-letter word, and you instantly concluded that there was a mind behind it. Why don't you do that with the 3.4 billion letters of DNA? I see you have a problem. And he had a problem. And I think again and again, I find people have just admitted they have never thought about it. But when they do, it poses them with a major issue, as Lewis knew it would.
That's very fascinating. And I love the way you've articulated those arguments to help people think and engage and get at the central issue. Yeah, I kind of want to take a little bit of a different question for you. I do think Christianity and science go very well, but what are some of the more significant challenges you've encountered and how have you responded to them?
Well, it depends who's doing the challenging. I think there are different kinds of atheists. There are the very dogmatic kind like Richard Dawkins and so on, who don't seem to listen to reason. But then there are others who are much more open. And generally speaking, I find there are challenges in explanation. Firstly, to get some of these people to see that their naturalism is a belief system. They tend to think that Christians are people of faith because they define faith as believing where there's no evidence, which makes it even worse. But atheists are not people of faith, which is nonsense. I mean, Dawkins asserts in one of his books that atheists have no faith and then spends 300 pages explaining what he believes. And that logical inconsistency bothers me. There's huge confusion out there as to the nature of faith. And what they don't realize, that faith is essential to science, and we hope that there it's evidence-based. The same is true of Christianity. It is only worthwhile if it is evidence-based. So getting these people to see that the Christian claims need to be taken seriously because they're evidence-based is a huge problem. The next challenge is to get them to understand the nature of scientific explanation, because very often they think in terms of an unthought out scientism, that science is the only way to truth. And therefore, worse still, that science is coextensive with rationality, whereas disciplines like history and philosophy and theology are perfectly rational. And therefore, they don't realize that there can be two explanations of the same phenomenon. Why is the water boiling? There's a heat explanation in terms of physics, but there's also the explanation that I like a cup of tea. It's a personal explanation. And those two explanations neither conflict nor do they compete, they complement. And yet, what amazes me, some of the cleverest people I know cannot see that at the big level of the universe. I often put it to them like this, that God no more competes with science as an explanation at that level than Henry Ford competes with the law of internal combustion as an explanation for a motor car. You need both. There are complementary explanations. Now, of course, there are lots more questions, but I find those two things go a long way in removing a lot of heat from this topic.
Well, thanks, John. I really appreciate your comments. You know, when we look at science and the Christian faith, there is this kind of very popular narrative that science and Christianity are opposed to one another. But when you really dig in, you see that science actually flourishes in a Christian worldview, and the atheistic or skeptical worldview actually is problematic for justifying the foundations of science.
I think
So
that's absolutely true. And what we've tried to do in this film is two things, actually. One is to film around Oxford and discuss the big issues between science and faith in God. But the second part of the film is done in Israel, where we're taking seriously the claim of Christianity to be rational in what it claims and what it asks us to believe. And that, to my mind, is equally important, because very often when I give talks, and you've probably found the same, on science and God, people will say, okay, there may be evidence of God in the universe, but you're a Christian. How do you take that extra step? And the whole point of this film is to marry those two sides of the question together. And I think it has at least succeeded in as far as the responses we've already had, but it remains to be seen when it's launched in the public on November 19 in the US.
No, I have to say, just personally, having watched the movie last week, I loved that juxtaposition of the two, where there's this, here's general scientific evidence, you know, and that you kind of go through that and you talk about your personal, but then there's also this, it's more than just science as well. And so I really appreciated that. Well, thanks, John. I appreciate your comments. You know, when there's this popular narrative out there that science is antithetical to Christianity or vice versa, that they're actually antagonistic to one another. And when you really dig into it, what you find is that science flourishes in a Judeo-Christian worldview. Whereas when you look at it from a naturalist worldview, there are serious problems that undermine the very foundations of science. You know, I would encourage you to go to againstthetide.movie. See this movie when it comes out. It will equip you to be able to articulate these arguments, engage in conversations with people who are skeptical of Christianity, and help them see just this awesome, beautiful, powerful, majestic creator that we serve and how they can know him also.